Some of the outcomes I hope we have today, folks will be familiar with at least 3 of the building blocks for LGBTQ inclusion. Participants will review 7 steps for creating an LGBTQ inclusive workplace, informing strategy, tactics, implementation, and evaluation. And attendees will learn at least 5 best practices for LGBTQ inclusion. So I'd like to start with some quotes from the business world, looking at LGBTQ inclusion and establishing the background for the business case for inclusion. The first I'll share, and I'm not going to read these all entirely out loud. You can read faster than I can say it, and you will also have all of this as a resource. From Deloitte, the most popular solution today is training, but while such interventions are helpful, it appears that making people aware is not enough. Organizations should consider making structural changes, implementing transparent data-driven solutions. And I'm going to stop there because structural changes are what's needed to shift culture. So that rather than a couple memos that go out and wind up filed away in a folder in someone's inbox, cultural change is something that lasts and can be built upon for future efforts, because the inclusion goals that we have today, again, just like our business goals, aren't the ones we had 5 years ago, and shouldn't hopefully be the ones that we have 5 years from now. So from Ogilvy Advertising, equality and inclusion are simply good for business. Nearly half of all Americans and 64% of those who identify as LGBTQ allies. So this isn't just the 8% of Americans or so who identify as LGBTQ. This is allies, which is a much larger number. Say that they're more likely to spend money with brands that are LGBT inclusive. So that's a big deal. If people are looking for gaps and opportunities in their marketing and planning, here's one right here. So I hope everyone is somewhat familiar with the HRC, the Human Rights Campaign. It's America's premier LGBTQ civil rights advocacy and lobbying organization. They publish annually, and they have for the last 17 years, a guide called the CEI, or Corporate Equality Index. So what this does is this looks at several parameters, and for the folks that participate, the companies that participate in their survey, looks at how they perform in those 3 main areas and the metrics that make them up and assign scores. So a 100% rating means that they're doing everything at this time within those buckets of data to provide a good workplace and a good work experience for LGBTQ employees. So this gives us a metric. It gives us something to work with when we're determining, are we being successful with our current diversity and inclusion programs for LGBTQ folk? And it can also be used, expanding and look at a company or organization's image, how they're perceived in terms of being LGBTQ inclusive. So these give some numbers from which we can base quantitative and qualitative goals. And I highly recommend it. If this is something that's not being used in conversations about diversity and LGBTQ equality and inclusion and building equity, I highly recommend it. So 2019, 572 businesses earned a 100% rating and a designation of being best place to work for LGBTQ equality. This is something that we see really valued by Fortune 500 companies. And these are the companies that drive our economy. These are the companies that have some of the largest workforces in our country, in the world. They're thought leaders and influencers. So the fact that they consider this important and part of their annual goals, as well as longer term strategies, it's a fact that you all can take with you and use when making the case for development for more inclusive strategies. So making that business case for LGBTQ inclusion, looking at HRC numbers, there are three main criteria that develop these ratings. The first, non-discrimination policies across business entities. So a large multinational company may have multiple businesses operating separately in the US, maybe on a global footprint. Do they have the same non-discrimination policies across that footprint, all the places they do business? Are they SOGI inclusive? SOGI being the acronym for sexual orientation, gender identity, to be included in non-discrimination policies and procedures. And are they applied consistently across different business units within those corporate frameworks across the US, regardless of state? Are there equitable benefits for LGBTQ workers and their families, significant others, and loved ones? And supporting an inclusive culture and corporate social responsibility. Are there, what are the specific activities that a company undertakes in order to include LGBTQ employees and concerns in their corporate culture and organizational conscience? So there's a cost to bias and to discrimination in the workplace against LGBTQ folk. We can actually put a price tag on that. We can put a number on that. According to the Center for American Progress, the cost per annum in terms of lost productivity, income, and contribution to the GDP is $64 billion a year. So that includes the annual cost of losing and replacing more than 2 million American workers who leave their jobs each year due to unfairness and discrimination. A significant number of those workers are gay and lesbian and transgender individuals who have been treated unfairly simply because of their sexual orientation and gender identity. The data is less firm on people who identify as bisexual and or queer. We know that we've had double-digit increases in terms of transgender workplace complaints of discrimination or adverse action. Even though we know that while someone can still file an EEOC complaint on the basis of trans discrimination at this time, unfortunately, HHS and the DOJ are not pursuing government enforcement in terms of criminal claims for discrimination, criminal charges with this administration. It is still possible, however, for employees to file EEOC complaints, hoping to be granted the right to sue by the EEOC for civil claims for discrimination on the basis of gender identity. According to a survey, and it's conducted every 5 years by the NCTE, the National Center for Transgender Equality. The name of the survey is the NTDS, National Trans Discrimination Survey. I'm going to try to keep the acronyms and initialisms as best as I can to a minimum, so please bear with me. A lot of these will be in the slides and or in the terminology materials that will get shared out with you. So trying not to be too jargony, probably not going to fully succeed at that. I appreciate your forbearance in advance. So according to the NCTE NTDS survey, fully 42% of gay or lesbian individuals have experienced some form of employment discrimination. Trans workers, it's even higher. It's 90%. 90% report mistreatment or discrimination on the jobs. and or taking actions such as hiding who they are to avoid discrimination. About 71% of trans Americans live stealth. So that means they don't reveal their trans status before social transition, that they are trans, they're closeted, or post-transition, they don't reveal their trans status. They prefer to be seen only as their actual gender and the matching gender expression, and if they're able to, the ID and documents that go along with that. Unfortunately, we have 50 different sets of rules on what it takes to get the type of ID needed to gain employment, maintain employment. Fewer than half of all trans people have a single piece of ID, one piece of ID, picture ID, that matches their appearance with their gender marker and the name that they use versus the name they were assigned at birth. And you can see right there, not having access to ID could be a real deep deal breaker for a lot of employers. Fewer than half of trans people have access to healthcare insurance, which limits their ability to have procedures done that are a part of gender confirmation surgery or hormone replacement therapy. And we still have in a majority of states a requirement that some type of medical intervention, be it surgical or endocrinological, be done before someone can apply to get the gender marker changed on their birth certificate or on their driver's license or state issued ID. So the barrier to healthcare becomes a barrier to the ability to access ID and the ability to be employed in a whole lot of places. So the states that are marked in green here on this map are the ones that protect both sexual orientation and gender identity discrimination in their state HRAs or human rights acts. There are an additional 3 states that protect for sexual orientation, but not gender identity discrimination. So that means in 27 states, it's explicitly legal according to state law to terminate someone's employment simply because they are trans. And only in 23 more states that applies to the L, the G, the B, and the Q. So a bit more on the regulatory environment. I hope everyone is somewhat familiar with the Supreme Court ruling on June 15th of this year. The Bostock ruling, really it should have been called the Bostock-Zarda-Stevens ruling, because there were 3 different cases that rolled into this case to be heard before the Supreme Court. Unfortunately, some of this litigation has been almost 8 years in the offing, and 2 of the 3 litigants unfortunately passed away before they were able to see this, this ruling. So the court ruled 6-3 with Associate Justice Gorsuch writing for the minority that, and I quote, "Discrimination on the basis of gender identity is discrimination because of sex, which is prohibited by Title VII. This is so because employers discriminating against gay or transgender employees accept a certain conduct in these employees of one sex, but not in employees of the other sex. So a woman can't be fired because she likes other women and pursues relationships and romantic interests with them, when it's perfectly acceptable for a male employee to do so." So this ruling is considered a narrow ruling because it really only affects hiring and firing. So it doesn't affect other conditions of employment, and it doesn't pertain to the other protected classes and aspects of the 1964 Civil Rights Act, including housing, education, healthcare, employment conditions, and public accommodations. So the Human Rights Campaign, CEI, that I spoke of earlier, I'd like to dive in and just take a small snapshot, not too granular, but a small snapshot of what these ratings mean. So we've looked at the 3 pillars that support them. We've discussed how they can be used to drive change and make a case for change, as well as a business case for LGBTQ inclusion. So the leftmost column, we see key indicators. That's including sexual orientation, non-discrimination policy, gender identity, trans healthcare, and public commitment to LGBTQ community. So looking at Fortune 500 companies that participate, I'm sorry, total Fortune 500 companies, then we'll look at survey participants, and then we will look at estimations of Fortune non-survey responders. So Fortune 500 companies all, 93% include sexual orientation in their non-discrimination policies. That's a big deal when we think of the regulatory environment and we don't have a single piece of federal legislation that mandates this. We now have the Bostock ruling, and depending on where you live, we have some federal circuit and appellate court rulings in favor, but we don't have any explicit legislation guaranteeing that sexual orientation is a protected class under civil rights law. But looking at Fortune 500 companies, 93%. The survey participants, 99%. Also, historically, this is a big deal too, because just 5 years ago, this number was only 75%. And when we look at the next number, the rate of change is even more dramatic. So including gender identity and non-discrimination policies. Right now, Fortune 500 all, 85%. And just a little shy under the numbers for sexual orientation for survey participants, 98%. So 85% is huge. Obviously 100% is ideal, but 85% is better than where it was 6 years ago when it was at 33%. So, we've seen almost a tripling of inclusion of gender identity in Fortune 500 non-discrimination policies in less than a decade. That is a steep growth rate, and something we should all think of as a big positive when we're having these conversations, either in an educational setting, advocacy, or consultative. Trans healthcare covered, 64%. This also is significant because there's only one piece of legislation that guarantees trans people have access to healthcare. That's healthcare, period, not just transition-related healthcare or transgender-specific healthcare, such as hormone replacement therapy, pre or post medical intervention, surgical intervention. This is just any kind of healthcare. And that comes to us through the 2010 Affordable Care Act. And it took effect after 3 different lawsuits in 2016. Before that, insurance companies, especially the 6 largest that insure almost 80% of us who have employer insurance, routinely rejected trans claims for healthcare when they were trans-specific, but also when they weren't. We refer to this as trans broken elbow syndrome. My elbow doesn't actually have any gender, not that I can tell. It seems a pretty functional joint in the body. However, a lot of trans people were in for a rude shock. Maybe they're playing softball, they fall, hit badly, break their elbow, go to the ER and find out they have a pre-existing condition, and that pre-existing condition was being transgender. And prior to the ACA enforcement of Section 1557, guaranteeing transgender Americans' right to access healthcare, they could be denied care for that broken elbow on the basis of being transgender as a pre-existing condition. So this is important for trans folks because if the Affordable Care Act is struck down and that provision is lost, it's possible that a lot of trans people will lose their access to healthcare. So when we look at Fortune 500 companies and the vast numbers of employees that work for them and are represented here, this is very reassuring to see that a lot of folks will still keep their health care. And even though we don't have federal explicit protection, we have situations like here in Missouri, where even though trans people are not covered under the State Human Rights Act, they are covered by municipal non-discrimination ordinances. So for example, Kansas City, Columbia, St. Louis, unincorporated St. Louis County, and 18 municipalities in St. Louis County all do have SOGI inclusions in their non-discrimination ordinances. So about 48% of the Missouri population is covered under those laws, even if there isn't an overarching state law protecting them. So 7 steps for creating an LGBTQ inclusive workspace. I draw these from GLAAD's recommendations, the Gay and Lesbian Anti-Defamation League, but also from the NCTE, the National Center for Transgender Equality, and SHRM, the Society for Human Resource Managers. So these are not the only 7, and there could be more, or if they were broken out in a more granular fashion, you could probably make it 10, 15, or 20. For the purpose of discussion today, I felt that these are the most important, and that's why I've assembled them into these 7 buckets. So number 1, creating safer workspace for all employees. It seems pretty easy enough as a goal, but without a lot of specific and explicit regulation, education, and enforcement, it's not going to just happen. Ensuring that all employees feel safe and comfortable, including clear anti-discrimination policies, along with enforcement mechanisms. We know that these policies live and breathe and are more meaningful in terms of organizational culture when the enforcement for these policies mirrors the enforcement for other infractions and is taken as seriously as other disciplinary models. Most companies have some form of progressive discipline, so something similar when it comes to violations of these policies puts some teeth in that enforcement and helps the buy-in. Although, of course, we want to put most of our time and effort and resources into education and prevention. Next point, forgive me, I am losing my voice. I'm going to take a real quick Diet Dr. Pepper break. I swear it's my only vice. I don't get paid any money for advertising this product. So, ethical disclosure right there. Let's see if I can talk again, much better. So in social psychology, we find that clear instructions to avoid stereotypes can be an effective way to reduce unconscious bias. I know that everyone participating in this conference, in this particular call, knows and is very familiar with and probably educates on a regular basis about implicit and explicit bias. And the Harvard implicit bias test is a fantastic tool. I find though that a whole lot of folks really don't care about that. Yeah, if you can get them to take it and then have conversation about it afterwards, you've really accomplished something. You've really done something, because it's a great way to open up conversation, because almost everybody is surprised when they take it. They find they have much more implicit bias than they had any idea that they were aware of. But in a workplace setting and as career service professionals and educators, if we do include examples of stereotypes in this education, it can be really effective. And it doesn't necessarily have to be LGBTQ in order to talk about gender and sexuality. a lot of the training that already exists and is out there can be modified without a whole lot of effort to be inclusive of LGBTQ experiences and circumstances as well. When an employee voices a complaint, be sure to promptly investigate. The lag time for investigation tells employees that the complaint isn't being taken seriously and that their concerns don't matter. And referring back to point 1 here, that their safety and well-being is not a priority. Now, that's looking prima facie, looking at complaints from LGBTQ employees about what they perceive as discrimination or even sexual harassment on the basis of sexual orientation and gender identity. But we have to remember a lot of it could also be folks that are uncomfortable with LGBTQ people, and we have to be aware of that. They have, a lot of folks have feelings about that, and their feelings are valid, even though maybe their opinions, might not be acceptable for expression in work in terms of conversation or behavior. We want everyone to be able to bring their whole selves to the workplace, but we also hope that whole self they're bringing represents their best self. It's entirely possible that people will complain about LGBTQ employees because they're offended that they have a picture of their spouse and themselves on their desk, and that's a same gender couple. Some folks could be upset about that. Some are disturbed if they see LGBTQ flags, stickers, pride icons or images around desk and work areas, and may complain about that. And to make it even more difficult for HR professionals, they may also say that it violates their religious beliefs. And that's a difficult conversation, however you slice it. Fortunately, there are probably already policies on how to handle these types of complaints in place. I highly suggest, though, that they be reviewed and folks look at how these could be used to undermine goals for LGBTQ diversity and inclusion without supporting other goals for non-discrimination inclusion on the basis of religious practice and or religious or ethnic identity. Last but not least, learn the art of conflict de-escalation. This is something that a lot of organizations struggle with. It's one thing to talk about training for de-escalation with HR and diversity, equity, inclusion professionals with upper management and key stakeholders. But when it comes time to take that down to intermediate range and wider range supervisors and managers, and so that they're empowered to teach and work with their direct reports regarding de-escalation, it can be tough. Modeling this in diversity training, and hopefully everyone has a robust schedule of ongoing diversity and inclusion training throughout the fiscal calendar. But modeling this and with role play can go a long ways. Seeing peers participating enthusiastically in this can go a long ways to modeling improvements in acceptance and behavior. A well-written mission statement, item 2 of 7, should reflect not just the goals, quantitative and qualitative, but also the values of your company. So we would always hope that this would be true, that organizational goals would be based upon values that were held to be as important as the mission and important as the qualitative and quantitative goals that, let's face it, a whole lot of executives, leadership, and key stakeholders have their bonuses based on. So, with money attached to it, when it comes time where effort is going to be devoted and resources for attainment, a lot of times it's right there because that's how people get paid. It's important, though, foundationally, and I mean literally foundationally, to ensure that the value statement is equal to the importance in corporate culture with the mission statement, and that it reflects the non-discrimination policies, and that the non-discrimination policies reflect that value statement. So this isn't just important as a 21st century item, to check off in terms of good corporate governance. This is important because it's important increasingly to employees. Looking at millennials, the age cohort born between 1980 and 1995, and the largest age cohort in the workforce today, a 2015 Deloitte survey tells us, and this is 7,800 millennials across 29 countries, so it's a pretty broad basis. The results tell us that almost 60% believe that business needs to reset its purpose, because while they believe the pursuit of profit is important in sustaining a business, it keeps the lights on, they also say that the pursuit must be accompanied by a sense of purpose, vision, and values. So a mission statement, most people have come on board that that's a must-have. A vision statement, maybe not so many organizations and corporate cultures, but a lot have it. But also a value statement, in addition to a mission statement and a vision statement. This is something that really resonates with the millennial age cohort, and even more so when we look at Generation Z coming behind them, folks born between 1995 and 2010, who are just now starting to enter the workforce. Train your staff on diversity and inclusion for LGBTQ issues. That's an easy goal to have. Almost everybody can probably say they have that now, but how is efficacy measured? How does one determine what success looks like? Are there concrete goals there? How do we know when we've gotten to the promised land, the pot of gold at the end of the rainbow? What does success look like, and how do we evaluate it? One thing to help ensure that those goals are met is, and I kind of referred to this on the first point, is to make sure that diversity and inclusion training regarding LGBTQ issues is made available to employees at all levels, and not just upper management or management. This requires a commitment from the company, because when you're looking at total workforce goals, time is money, and there's a dollar value attached to this. But if it's organizationally important, it should be included in budget conversations so that it can be made real. It should be time bound. When is it going to happen? Who is going to do it? What's the cost? It's in the budget. Because without hitting those points, it's not going to happen. Or if it does, chances are it's not going to be effective. Support and fund company-wide LGBTQ resource and affinity groups. Most companies have some type of ERG, employee resource group or affinity group, one for LGBTQ folk, and allies can go a long ways towards realizing these goals. Some companies have some fun with it. Companies here in our area, like Amazon, that has a heavy footprint with logistics and warehousing in the St. Louis area. Their LGBTQ ERG is called Glamazon for gay and lesbian employees at Amazon. Microsoft, Glean, gay and lesbian employees at Microsoft, and then our own Boeing, Boeing Employees Association of Gays, Lesbians, and Friends. I think that was a little awkward getting it to fit into Beagles, but I love the intent and the inventiveness. So, these have serve several good purposes. Community. It also provides another framework, another reference for LGBTQ issues outside of management, HR, and D&I. It takes the pressure off of LGBTQ employees who should really have to sing for their supper. And while they're doing everything else that they've been hired to do, also serve as ambassadors and advocates for LGBTQ folk, just so they can be treated with the same respect that we'd like to think was due all employees. So this allows conversations to happen with allies, associates, people who are just curious about LGBTQ issues and experiences without necessarily putting LGBTQ employees on the spot. Providing equivalent benefits for same-gender couples. This is something that we hope is addressed with the passage of the Equality Act. Referring back to the regulatory environment. Unlike the old ENDA Act, the Employment Non-Discrimination Act that would have explicitly in legislation guaranteed LGBTQ people's rights in employment, relating them to employment rights under the 1964 Civil Rights Act. Unlike ENDA, the Equality Act would explicitly guarantee access to all the protected statuses for sexual orientation and gender identity under the 1965 Civil Rights Act. And that would include that if medical and health benefits and other perks were made available for any employees and their spouses and or families, then they would have to for same-gender couples as well. Anything made available for single employees would have to be made available for single trans employees also. Another aspect of the Equality Act is if a company has had, before Obergefell and marriage equality in that 2015 ruling, if a company had civil commitment or other relationship recognitions for either couples unable to marry pre-Obergefell or for couples that didn't want to marry but are committed and living with each other and intend to continue to do so indefinitely, then those benefits would extend to same gender and trans couples as well. Something important to think about here, a lot of companies have been moving away from offering those benefits to unmarried couples for employees, because the idea is, well, now that everybody can get married, they don't need civil unions. And so we don't need recognition of the benefits dependent upon civil unions in an HR environment. But what's happening is by removing them with the assumption that now everybody can just get married, we're seeing straight couples being denied access, unmarried straight couples being denied access to benefits. So this is an unintended consequence of the focus on marriage equality, and some folks in consideration of their needs falls between the cracks. I think it's important to mention that here as a part of this conversation. Inviting an inclusion and diversity expert or panel of experts to speak about LGBTQ issues and unconscious bias. So this accomplishes several things. It shores up and supports an organization's current diversity objectives by bringing in outside expertise or a panel with multiple persons representing that expertise and experience. Not every company has a trans or LGBTQ person on staff who can represent those identities and experiences and issues in education. And also, by bringing in folks who are quite comfortable, talking about how they're out and what are their identities. Conversations can be had that might otherwise be pretty uncomfortable for LGBTQ people. I started this conversation today talking about the fact that I'm a trans person who's female and also a lesbian, and consider myself one half of a queer couple. So obviously, I'm quite comfortable talking about who I am and my identities, but not everyone is. And a lot of people aren't necessarily eager to share that part of themselves at work because of fear of discrimination. And then lastly, participating in local LGBTQ events and festivals. Just as we have on the counter, municipal fall festivals, Halloween parades, big sporting events, including things that are a part of LGBTQ experience on that corporate calendar, goes a long way to show that these employees and their lives and the events that matter to them matter to the organization. Also, combining the calendar with activities that can be spearheaded through ERGs and affinity groups. It's a great way to offer another aspect for building community within the organization, as well as allyship and general team building. I'm thinking about activities that happen here in St. Louis, for examples. The Metro Trans Umbrella Group has the Transgender Memorial Garden. It's in the Grove District, and it's a memorial representing the lives of all trans people who have been lost to homicide and violence. The event goes back to 1999. This is the first garden in the United States that recognizes trans folk in that way. And they have a calendar for cleanups every other month. And companies fight to see who gets to be number one and bring the largest number of employees, to help do cleanup in the garden. Ameren, for example, one year brought 80 people. At that point, people were elbow to elbow. The garden isn't that big. But the enthusiasm gave quite a nice story to tell, share within the company and the general public as well as within the community. Best practices. This will be about 5 more minutes, and then we'll have 7-8 minutes, and I'll do my best to deal with any questions. And some that have popped up in chat, I've been able to address as we go. Any other questions I'm not able to get, you do have my contact information, and I please invite all of you to think of me as a resource. Go ahead and email, and I'll answer your questions as best as I can. Best practices. So I give a training as part of an institute day that focuses for 2 hours just on best practices. What I've done here is kind of singled out what I believe are some of the most important and foundational best practices that can be worked into an organizational culture, not only at a management, HR, and DEI level, but can become baked into the DNA of the organization. First point, modernizing harassment prevention training with realistic and representative scenarios, including those reflecting LGBTQ issues. Sexual harassment prevention training is seldom on anyone's favorite training to-do list, but including LGBTQ issues, I promise, is less painful than it might seem. I have seen 100% success rate in terms of people incorporating these, and no fatalities yet in terms of robust sexual harassment prevention and education training. Developing gender transition resources for employees. So again, I give entire trainings just on this subject. There are a couple models that I would like to recommend to you. They get very granular. They take you from policy, pros and cons, legal liability, the way to avoid liability, risk mitigation, and assessment. Models that I particularly recommend, GLAAD, G-L-A-A-D, and SHRM, and NCTE, the National Center for Transgender Equality. And at the end of this deck of slides, the contact information for all of those groups and their websites is included with this deck. So a plan for a person to come out, how to communicate that, where's their comfort level, how the employee can help them do so, reducing friction with coworkers, having a gender transition plan in place is important to have, because if the organization is of any size, If they haven't dealt with this issue already, they're almost guaranteed to. There are about 1.4 million trans people in the US. There are 2.2 intersex people, and there are another 1.3 million gender expansive identified people in the US. And we think those numbers are low because I refer back, a lot of people, over 2/3, live stealth and do not reveal their trans status. So approximately 5 million people. Chances are, if your organization is a very much size at all, this is an issue that you'll need to navigate. If you have a policy and set of procedures in place beforehand, everything, I promise, will go much more smoothly. And again, I have links to the models from those organizations that I recommended as part of the resources for this presentation. Creating inclusive policies reflecting current nomenclature. So there are terms that we don't use so much anymore because they've got history and baggage associated with them. You know, the word gay, for example, is not a stand-in for LGBTQ. Not everybody who's LGBTQ is gay. And for people who are same gender attracted, there are a lot that would not use the term gay because they don't feel that it would apply to them. Another term to think about, transsexual. You know, this is a term that doesn't have a lot of stigma associated with it. In Europe, it's very commonly used. In the United States, however, it really implies a distinct judgment upon the validity of someone's gender identity and gender expression. In other words, you know, if you haven't had at least this much time on hormone therapy or this much surgery, or if you don't wear this much makeup, you're not authentic, and we're all just being nice to you by pretending your gender is real. So by avoiding terms that can be kind of loaded, like transsexual, instead of the umbrella term of just trans, you know, we can go a long ways towards creating, you know, the more ideal culture that's reflective of the values that we want to uphold. Another thing to do here is also looking for unnecessarily gendered language, starting with the company handbook, procedures and policies. You know, where it says serviceman, there's no reason why they can't say service tech, service person, service expert. So eliminating unnecessarily gendered language is another aspect of this point, including LGBTQ demographics and diversity and inclusion data. And lastly, asking senior leaders to sponsor and support LGBTQ organizations. So that's not just ERGs and not just LGBTQ events. It's great if a company has a giant parade in the Pride Festival downtown, but that shouldn't be the end all or be all of LGBTQ you know, community support initiatives. So now that we've covered best practices, I want to make sure that the rest of this time is made available for questions. I will look at what you've got in chat. If you haven't placed one in chat, please go ahead. See if we can't